Good afternoon and welcome to the members and the guests of the Life Planning Network. My name is Bruce Frankel and I'm the president of the Life Planning Network. For those who don't know, our mission is to lead, educate, support, and inspire positive aging professionals working to optimize lives, counter ageism, and benefit society. The Life Planning Network serves professionals from diverse disciplines, advocating healthy, creative, conscious, and socially productive aging. It's my pleasure to welcome Megan Gerhardt, a professor of management and director of leadership development at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University. She developed Gentelligence concept to help organizations change the way they approach generational differences. Dr. Gerhardt's work focuses on leveraging individual differences to achieve extraordinary levels of performance. She spent a couple of decades researching and consulting with corporations to improve the intergenerational workshop, which culminated in her book, which she did with a couple of associates, called Gentelligence, the revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce. I highly recommend it. It's really good. She also serves as Director of Leadership Development, as well as the Robert D. Johnson Co-Director of the Isaac and Oxley Center for Business Leadership. She received her PhD at University of Iowa, and in addition to Gentelligence, she's authored lots of journal articles, and her work has been featured in Harvard Business Review, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, NBC News, and others. So we're lucky to have her with us, and I'm grateful for her willingness to be with us today. So,
well, thank you so much for the invitation. That was lovely. Hello, everybody.
Welcome, Megan. So is it okay if I call you Megan?
Of course, everyone should.
Okay, good. So why don't you start by just telling us how you became interested in the problem as a young professor 20 years ago?
Sure. This is the story I love to start with. So I did start as a professor at Miami University. I had just turned 26, so that was 20 years ago this year, and had a lot I needed to learn, as you might imagine. And I learned a great deal, as most of us do, from my older colleagues. But was in this really unique position where I was closer in age to my students than I was to many of the people I was working with. And so really naturally, I found myself turning to those younger than me for input and getting their perspective and feedback on things. It was not uncomfortable at all. It was very natural given my age and my sort of career stage. And after several months, I realized that the learning was obviously quite different in the different directions, but that both of the learning I was getting was really important and it was making me better at my job. And so it really motivated me to think about how are others across workplaces, organizations, society, how are they leveraging this kind of age and generational diversity for this kind of learning and collaboration and growth? And this was about the time our millennials had just started entering the workforce. So as you might imagine, the answer was most people were not happily leveraging generational diversity. They were just tearing their hair out a little bit. So I became fascinated on researching and then consulting and speaking on how do we change the way we're viewing this, that we're viewing this kind of really valuable diversity in a way that's very counterproductive and really toxic to what we could be learning and accomplishing through collaboration. So that's led to all the other things that you mentioned in that lovely introduction, including the book and the more recent work. So that's the story.
And what could you tell us what your first glimpses of the destructiveness of intergenerational hostility in the workforce was? What was your first experience of that? And
yeah, it was interesting. I think one of the things I notice even today with my students, so being a professor, I get front row seat to whatever the latest generation is. I get them first before they come out and work with all of you. So, I think I got a lot of questions from colleagues who I was working with in terms of the classroom environment. But then also, I remember the first speaking engagement I got, it was something like, they're hoping you can come help them figure out what to do with these millennials, like a capital T, capital M. And it's as we've talked about, not a new issue. There's always, when we were researching the book, we came across so many great quotes. There was a Life magazine article from 1958 that said, the kids these days, what's wrong with them? And then things from Plato, back a very, very long time ago. But I think really my first experience with it was the disconnect between my positive experience and the grumbling I heard. Interestingly, most of the initial requests I got and the initial frustration were coming from professionals who had children the age of their youngest employees.
Huh.
So these would have been baby boomers who had children that were millennials, who they had, and I'm really, if you've read the book, I'm very much against generational stereotyping, but I do like talking about generational norms. I think that's the best way to sit on that. So you talk about generational stereotypes, and I know I'm talking to experts. So you've all seen that really surface level generational training where they say, like, you're a baby boomer, these 4 things happen to you. This is how you think, and this is how you behave. And I hate that. I always say before I do anything that's not what you're going to get from me, because that's why people don't take this as seriously as they should, because they feel like they're being put in a box or stereotyped. So, I do a lot of discussion with people around the fact that your generational identity is just a layer. Your age is a layer. And so those things, age and generation even, are different and interact, but also gender and socioeconomic status and everything else that we get, cultural identity. But the reality was, when we did think about millennials, we had as a norm, as a society, the norm was starting to shift, where many millennials were being raised as the center of their family unit. Resources were being devoted to their development, their education, their scheduling. We had gone from sort of a children should be seen and not heard mentality for us Gen Xers and all the generations that came before us, to sort of a social experiment of, baby boomers who had worked incredibly hard to create more opportunity for the future than they themselves had when they were growing up, wanted to give that to their children. And that's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing. But those were the people who were calling me first. And I had a lot of really blunt conversations that, you've raised your children to be proactive and raise their hand and go after what they want and tell their boss they have this great idea, or tell me as their professor that they don't get C's and can we please discuss why they should get a B instead. But then when their employees were doing it, they didn't like it. They saw that as entitled. And so the TEDx talk I did years ago was sort of pointing out that whether you view a behavior as proactive or entitled depends on the side of the room you're standing on. So I think the first examples I got were really the millennial baby boomer disconnect. The media, of course, played a huge role and still does in sort of the generational shaming of pitting generations against one another, which is incredibly detrimental and unnecessary, instead of helping us recognize the collaboration opportunities that are there.
Yeah. I love the story that you told early in the book about the first time I think you were speaking at one of these corporate events, or maybe it was not that, I can't quite remember, where the expectations on response to an email or a suggestion were so at variance that the boomer generation, if they got a request for if they got somebody who wrote them an idea, they thought they could wait a while to respond, whereas the Gen Xer timetable was quite different than theirs, and that leads to the generational divide sometimes, right? Is that?
It does. And I will say 2 things on that. So one is, I did a session for Co-Generate last week. That was great. We had like over almost 400 people that attended, and someone asked the question of, is communication is like a red herring? Is it really that important, these communication differences? And I said yes, because it's a seemingly small thing that becomes a big thing. So it's one of those things that represents deeper issues that we want to explore. And that's what Gentelligence helps us do. So for example, something like communication, I talk a lot about the fact that we all have common needs across every age and generation. So say we don't is a stereotype and is inaccurate. So one of them is need for connection, need for respect, need to be seen as competent. There's several. But where we tend to follow, if we just stop there, then we'd say, well, then generational differences really aren't real, because look, we all need the same thing. But the more interesting story to me is that, yes, we all have those needs, but the generational norms we've learned on how you fulfill those needs are very different. That's where we tend to get stuck. So per your example that you brought up, communication is one that I love to talk about. So, if you even say to a team, of a multi-generational team, when I say communication, what does that mean to you? You're going to get some really fascinating answers. And if it's something like, well, I sent an email, why didn't anyone respond? And somebody else saying, well, I assumed if it was urgent, you would text me. And somebody else saying, I don't, there's also things in the book about, generational differences in whether you text colleagues and when do you do that? And those little things that actually need to be dissected to figure out, what do we mean by communication? What does that mean to you? Or what's your norm for, if I send you a text, my dad is like the classic example. He's 74. He's a baby boomer. He views texting as a passive thing. So I'll send him something and he won't respond. And I'll say, did you not get my text? He's like, yeah, I got it. I said, well, you didn't respond. He's like, it didn't constitute a response. Like, it's just a very different, whereas I think if someone texts me, I'm supposed, our norm is you write back. And so not wrong or right, just different. Right. And if you get hung up on judging the behavior without understanding the intent, that's where we tend to get in trouble, I think.
So are there other other nexus of generational divide that you see? Communication is one. Are there any others that you?
Yeah, I think we talk in the book about communication is not one specifically that we list in this category, but we call them roadblocks, because I've yet to speak to a group that doesn't think the idea that generations and different ages should be able to collaborate productively. No one thinks that's a bad idea, but the question is, well, then why aren't we doing it? And there's some roadblocks we identified. So the first we've already touched upon, which is generational shaming. The fact that we can, at work or in the media say, okay, boomer, or entitled millennial, or Gen Z snowflake, or Gen X slacker, like that, any of those, they're viewed as amusing or entertaining. But if you think about swapping out some other kind of difference for your generation, right? If you talked about, women or Hispanics or, any part of difference, we would all be horrified to see a headline like that. We wouldn't tolerate that. But with generation, it's funny. Or age, right? Ageism, as AARP says, is the last acceptable kind of discrimination. And so, I think generational shaming is a big one. It's a clickbait thing for media that they kind of feed it because it's something everybody has a story to tell about or wants to talk about. Ageism and stereotyping, as you all know, is a big issue. Over 20% of discrimination cases with the EEOC last year were based on age. And that, of course, is just older age discrimination, because reverse age discrimination isn't illegal, federally illegal. So that, of course, is a big issue. And then the other two we talk about, one is this myth about those underlying needs and values being different. So you can say kids these days, or I don't understand that generation, or okay, boomer, and you're ignoring the fact that, if you dig past behavior to intent, there's a lot of common ground there that we tend to miss. And then the last one that might be really relevant to this group that I'm fascinated with is this sort of idea of knowledge relevance. So, I deal with this a lot where, and millennials brought this to a boiling point too, which is relevant to an earlier question you asked me, is it's relatively new that a younger generation knows how to do something faster or easier than an older generation. That's pretty new. And of course, I want to make sure to point out that older people are just as able to use technology well as younger people. That's a stereotype. But we differ in our interest and how prevalent and how motivated we are to have technology more so than ability. But if we take even something like technology, when millennials came on the scene, they grew up learning something that the rest of us had to catch up, right? They grew up just knowing it. It was natural kind of learning, and the rest of us were on a learning curve to get there. And we absolutely can get there if we want to. But that was an upset of the apple cart to have a generation of 20-somethings that were coming in, having this digital savvy that the rest of us were catching up to. And so that has continued, whether you think of it as social media or AI or whatever you're thinking about as the new thing. So the roadblock is, if what that generation or the youngest generation coming in knows is so valuable and important, it creates the sense of perceived threat. Is what I know how to do, which is, many things, is that less relevant and important around here because they suddenly know how to do something new. And that threat kind of kills the psychological safety. And I don't want to go collaborate with that person. I'm going to go stand over here in my office and do what I want to do and protect myself because I'm feeling like I'm not valued at the level I should be around here. So that's a big roadblock, is it's hard to want to collaborate when you're not sure whether you're being appreciated for the value you bring. So those are the broad roadblock categories we talk about in the book.
Well, I mean, that's very interesting. So how does that become damaging in business and society? How does that translate into how it affects and hurts society or the workplace more particularly?
Yeah, I could talk a lot. There's a couple I'm going to focus on. One, I think, is age polarization. So really interestingly, we don't tend to work closely with people that are a lot older or younger than us. We enter our age cohorts, into our organizations with people similar in age. And because of that, we don't have close relationships with people a lot older or a lot younger. And when we have that polarization, we tend to just fill in the blanks. We don't know anybody who's 27. And so we just sort of go with the stereotypes or go with what we've heard instead of having, as we know, those personal relationships help us really combat those stereotypes. So that's one thing, is if we don't work proactively to break age polarization, it's hard for us naturally to get to know people older and younger and understand those stereotypes aren't usually true. I think in the last one maybe is the most interesting one. So how does knowledge relevance get in our way? Well, right now, of course, the demographic shift, the fact that we have a substantial number of older employees who want to remain in the workforce, who are healthy, who are working and living decades longer than previous generations. So number one, how do we keep that segment of our workplace engaged as long as they would like to be engaged? We're losing talent in that age group really quickly. And before the pandemic, it was sort of, well, when will the baby boomers retire? And I think post-pandemic, we're seeing that the baby boomers who are leaving, many are going somewhere else. They're not retiring or leaving the workplace. They're just saying, well, I don't feel valued here. I'm part of the Great Resignation. I'm going to go start my own business or move and be a mentor somewhere else where I'm more appreciated. So that's an impact, particularly on all generations, but the older one particularly. And then I think the last thing I want to say about that is, I have seen every day our threat about knowledge relevance can get in the way of knowledge transfer, both directions. So Gentelligence is about every generation having something to teach and something to learn. So what we see is younger people who don't feel like older people care about their input or value their opinion. They shut off and don't want to listen to older people who have lots of experience and insight and wisdom. They tend to view it as being lectured at. I don't want to be lectured at. You don't know how things are these days. A panel I did a couple weeks ago, there was a man in the chat who said, I have so much insight I want to share, but it doesn't seem like anyone cares. And it was a very sad kind of comment. And I actually, like, I saw it whiz by, this chat was on fire, and I went back, I caught his name, and I went back and, messaged him, and I said, well, this is what I found, and feel free to use it, and I hope it's helpful. That particularly with our younger generations, if they feel heard, they will listen. So, and that's just good leadership 101, but particularly millennials and Gen Z were raised with a voice. They were raised to believe their voice mattered and their needs mattered. We did a lot of work to protect their self-esteem. And then we got kind of mad when they showed up and wanted to use their voice and, had a strong sense of self. So I said to him, the magic phrase, which is not rocket science, that I use almost every day is, I'd love to know what you think of this, or could you tell me how you would do this? So let's say, for example, I met my classes for the first time this semester on Monday. We're talking about artificial intelligence and the chat GPT and how artificial intelligence can write their essays for them. And I thought, they are going to have to be the ones to help us solve this challenge. I don't actually know how we integrate this in an ethical way, but I bet they have an idea. And so I just said, you guys, here's my challenge. I want you to learn. I want to see that you're learning and proficient. I know there's the software you could use. How do we solve this problem? I'd love to know how you see it. I'd love to know what you think. And they were kind of stunned, I think, that they were asked rather than me telling them what the policy was going to be. And not only did we have a great discussion, I had 2 students come in for an hour to show me the tool and what they thought it could and couldn't do, and how they thought they should be able to use it and how they shouldn't be able to use it. And I'll tell you, every time I ask them, I find they're 10 times as interested in listening to me, because I first listen to them. And often the things they'll tell me, it's not like I just blindly take them as truth. I'll say, let's talk about that one. That's interesting. Or, hey, that's illegal. We can't actually do that. Whatever it is, they're 20. So, but it's kind of a magic phrase that first asking opens up this door. Well, they think, well, I want to listen to this person because they respect me and they care about my input. So, I think for younger generations, getting the knowledge and wisdom of older people, that's really key. And then I think in the other direction, I count myself as an older person because I'm 25 years older than my students now. So I count myself, as somebody who always has to think, just because they know new things, that's actually good news for me, because if they're willing to teach me, I can continually learn, and it also gives me a better opening to teach them.
I love that. And it's something I think we always have to remind ourselves of, because it's easy to lapse into thinking that someone younger doesn't know. I particularly thought it back when I was in college and got brought up on plagiarism charges, and the professor who brought me up on plagiarism charges eventually had to apologize. And his comment to me was that he was surprised that someone younger could have such thoughts. So, it's like now I'm of age where I might lapse into the same thing. But so it's a great reminder to ask people who are younger than us for solutions as well. Are there any other key practices that you would recommend, or that you, in terms of solutions or helping people to navigate if they're in the workforce or otherwise, the intergenerational divide?
Yeah, I'm going to pull up. I'm not going to drown you in slides, so I'm just going to jump to a slide here. Just to kind of show you. So what's really interesting is these are the 4 practices from our book. The one that I talked about how would you do it is one of our actionable tools for this third one, right? Creating psychological safety, and it transitions into the last one, which is about creating win-win, right? The idea that you can teach me something and then maybe I can teach you something, and then look where we are collectively. But there are a few others. I won't spend more than a few minutes. I know we want to get to the questions of everybody on the call. And since I know that you all are kind of ahead of my normal audience in what you understand about this topic, I do want to share, every one of these has a quick tool or question after it. So this first one is, assumptions in terms of yes, things like implicit bias, and what assumptions are we making about someone based on age, older or younger. But there's also this really interesting piece to it that I want to pull out. So the tool we suggest in the book is called an assumption audit. So the first part is just being on high alert of where you hear yourself or other people making those assumptions. And I, of course, when I hear that, I always say, if somebody makes an assumption, my phrase I like to use is like, oh, I don't understand what you mean by that. Can you help me understand that? Right? Like bias 101, any kind of bias, like asking the question. But I actually want to bring attention to the second one, which I think is probably less talked about than things like implicit age bias, which is, where are we assuming that we're all on the same page when we're not? So the communication one is a great example, but I've had this topic explode in so many different workshops I've done. So right now, words like flexibility or success or transparency. So I did a talk at a hospital where the older and younger employees were really locked into some battles about need for transparency, and had dug in on both sides. And I just came in and said, well, when I say transparency, what does that mean to you? And it turned out in 5 minutes, we figured out that the younger employees define transparency as, I'd like an explanation as to why certain decisions were made the way they were made. Whereas the older and more senior, in this case, leadership, thought they wanted sort of the keys to the vault of confidential information or things they weren't supposed to have. And so that assumption that they wanted something they weren't allowed to have had really caused friction, when in fact they were happy to provide an explanation to the younger people about why they had made decisions a certain way. And the younger people didn't have any illusion they were going to get the confidential information. So there's certain words, depending on the industry or the group you're working with, when words are being used a lot, I always like to sort of throw the flag and say, I'd love to know how people define that. Be responsive, or, work ethic or accountability, or success is a big one. What does success mean to you? There's real generational norms around that. I'll do one or two more and then we can go to questions. So this practice is called adjust the lens, and this one's my favorite. And this is that one that really digs into be curious, not judgmental, the Walt Whitman quote, where this is the one where I use the story all the time. I should probably put my dad on my payroll, but I use the story all the time of, he was an attorney in a law firm. He was a partner. And when my book came out, he said, all right, you're so smart. That's how my dad talks. He said, when I started my career, the norm was you put your head down, you worked hard, you kept your mouth shut, you did what you were told, and then you earned your way into, your promotion. You waited for somebody to tap you on your shoulder and tell you it was time for your promotion. And he said, by the time I retired, these kids were coming and telling me it was time for their promotion. And I didn't like that. I didn't get it. And I thought, oh, what a great sort of identify assumptions, adjust the lens. So we talked a lot about how, the need is the same for respect and to be seen as competent, but his generation was taught, you put your head down, you keep your mouth shut until it's your turn. And the millennials were taught, you go after it. You're good enough. You go grab that promotion and put your hand up, tell them you're ready. And I said, it's the same need. It's just a different set of behaviors. So there's a lot of examples we give in the book. There's a great one we talk about a lot around adjusting your perspective when someone takes out their phone or takes out their computer. Like, what do you immediately attribute that to? They're distracted or they're being disrespectful, rather than they're taking notes, or, whatever it might happen to be. So the tool on this one is literally curiosity over judgment. So when you start getting sort of frustrated or judging a behavior as wrong, you have to sit back and think, well, it looks wrong because it's not the norm I'm used to, or the norm that I believe is the right one. But, there's another magic Gentelligence phrase. Can you help me understand? So I did that last semester. I was running a meeting with some students, and all the laptops were out, and I was kind of irritated because this was like a brainstorming meeting, and I'm like, you're working on your homework or something. So instead, I practice what I preach. I try to, and I said, can you help me understand why all these laptops are out? And, one of them spun it around, and they're like, oh, I have a Google Doc. I'm taking notes. I thought I would share with the group. And I was like, yeah, you will. That's exactly what I want you doing. Good job. So I think, can you help me understand? How would you do it? Those are all, I think, really easily applied tools that show you're more interested than you are judgmental. So those would kind of be the ones that I would recommend right off the bat.
Well, really a lot to think about and to talk about, but I do want to give everyone a chance to ask you a question. So thank you so much for answering mine. And let's open it up to folks. So why don't you raise your hand and I'll call on you. Marilyn, you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
2 questions. Where are you? Oh, there you are. First, where do I get your book?
Well, Amazon, usually they don't do a great job of keeping it in stock, but I think it is in stock this week. Or they don't sell in physical bookstores, but any like online independent bookstore should have it, hopefully. Thank you for asking.
The second thing is about onboarding and working from home. And my concern is about, how do you integrate a younger generation into the culture of the workplace if they don't go there?
Yeah, what a great question. I just recently did a blog about this, the quiet quitting that I know you've all probably heard of, and I called out, I said, well, the reason they're quote quiet quitting and not putting forth as much effort is because we forgot how important it is for in-person interaction to create employee engagement and to create a sense of professional identity. And I coach students, they're not students anymore, they're always my students, but they're not officially. I coach people who graduated anywhere from 6 to 5 years ago who are saying, I've never met my boss in person, or I try to go into the office during my day in the office, but nobody else is there. And they're leaving those organizations because they don't feel part of it. So I think, per your question, first, we don't forget, particularly at that age and career stage, how important it is. I'm not saying hybrid work doesn't have wonderful perks to it, but at the beginning of your career, when you're learning what the culture of an organization is, and you're learning how to be a professional person, you can't substitute being able to grab lunch with coworkers or pop your head in your boss's office. So I think we need to ask our younger employees, my goal is for you to feel part of this, to feel like you're connected to us, whether we're, working remotely or in person. How can I help that happen for you? Can we maybe you can grab in-person coffee, but you have to do a little extra work to make it happen. Can we coordinate our day we're going to come in? Can we do a Zoom coffee? Like, what do you need, instead of assuming that we know, because nobody knows how to do this, that we're just all writing the handbook on how to lead people this way in this kind of an environment. So I think we, first of all, recognize how important it is that we don't lose that piece. And then we ask them what they need. That would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Julie has her hand up. Julie, why don't you go ahead and ask? And Julie has a great perspective because she's also teaches at a college and university. So she's got all sides of this, I think.
Megan, thank you so much. This is fascinating, the stuff you're bringing up. And so I'm an adjunct professor at Regis College. And through some of the courses I've taught, a lot of the stuff you're bringing up rings so true. For example, a course where part of it involved looking at ageism. And I had an older person come in and speak about things from their perspective. And then I had the students engage in a dialogue with this older person. And my sense was a lot of the stuff that was causing friction could be boiled down to misunderstandings. And then another course that I taught, lifespan development. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how studies have been done where how teenagers, the way that they will interpret a facial expression is very different than how an older person, such as a parent, will interpret the same expression. Hence, why there is often so many misunderstandings between the parents and their children. So it almost it boils down to biological explanations in terms of how we interpret the same thing. So again, thank you so much. This is really fascinating.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you're so right. I think I have a 17-year-old. So I try, I find myself all the time having to catch myself and adjust the lens. So, a couple of weeks ago, I was out of town and he was having some sort of existential crisis. And I texted and said like, hey, can I call you so we can talk about this? He's like, no, I don't want to talk about it. Which if you have a kid or a grandkid that age, you understand. And so I just started texting him because I thought, oh, communicate to me means let me just pick up the phone and call you. But I think we exchanged 50 text messages about the topic. So it wasn't that he didn't want to talk about it. He just didn't want to talk about it. Right. And so I adjusting the lens and saying, well, what does he need? Even if it's not the way I would do it, it's not really about me. So I totally agree with you, Julie. It's often misunderstanding more so than maybe fundamental, difference in opinion. And if we can cut that part out, we're going to be a lot closer for sure.
Thank you. Tim is calling in from Hawaii. And so Tim, you want to go ahead and open up your mic and ask your question?
Hi, folks. Aloha.
Hello.
The Wi-Fi from the third coconut tree is a little bit weak. But my question to you, Megan, is this. Do people look at the knowledge of the older generation as appreciated, but not valued in that they look at it as perishable or dated? There's one thing where they would, okay, I'll listen to you, but I don't really give that much value to that experience. I've not lived long enough to say, you know what? I think I'm going to appreciate that as I get older. We have lived longer, so when we look back, we can say, I was young once, and I know that I thought I knew everything, and now I'm a little bit more open to ideas. So I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile that, and what does that communication look like, knowing that maybe there's a little bit of contempt of our ability to make our information up to date or at least seem relevant?
Yeah, what a great question. I think it depends. I think it depends on how that wisdom is framed and delivered per some of the earlier things we talked about. So I will say, we have definitely seen a shift. Of course, generational conflict, as we talked about, is an age-old, pun intended, issue. But certainly we used to have a stronger societal norm around, quote, respect for elders. And what I mean by that is, if the person older than me says it, even if I don't agree with it or like it, I have to keep my mouth shut and write it down, or I'll be tested on it, or it's their way or the highway, and really you could think of it as power distance, right? So our power distance has shrunk over time where, younger generations have a more informal relationship with adults, whether it's their parents, friends, teachers, bosses, calling them by their first name. Again, little things that, depending on who the target is or who's hearing it, can be judged as disrespectful. So I do think, particularly in the US, and there's obviously different cultures around the world have different views on how they view aging and how they view elders. So that's important to point out. But I think a lot of it is, as older people, us thinking about the fact that our experience isn't going to be readily savored and appreciated as wisdom just because we're older, because there is that high risk that it's going to be seen as, oh gosh, is she talking again? Am I going to get a lecture about how this is how it used to be. And I was at a workshop last week in Kansas where somebody said, I have a mentor. It was a faculty workshop. My mentor and I meet once a month and I really respect him, but a lot of his advice isn't relevant anymore. And I don't know how to be I don't want to be disrespectful, but I also don't think it's very helpful. And so I think jumping off of that, I would go back to what kind of knowledge do we have to give? So in the book, we delve into something I found really fascinating on types of knowledge. So there's things like know what, know how, know when, know why. There's all these different sort of pieces, which if we think about it that way, there's room for all of our different kinds of knowledge. So I think if you approach it as, I'm fascinated by what younger people know and are interested in their perspective. I want to know what's important to them. I want to hear their ideas because I believe my experience and wisdom and ideas merged with theirs is how we move forward. So I think when we get into the habit of wanting to substitute their perspective for ours, like sit down, let me tell you how it is, that's when they stop listening, right? But if we say, I'd love to hear, and maybe we have to be the bigger people and ask first, right? I'd love to hear what you think about this. And then we slide in the knowledge and experience and say, oh, that's such a great idea. I have a couple things that I would love to ask or talk to you about that I think might help that idea really get some traction. So one of the ones we talk about a lot is know when. That older people, the benefit of experience is often you know when or you know how. So hey, politically, if you want that idea to go somewhere, don't talk about it today during the budget meeting, wait till next week, right? Or go tell Ted and Ted will help you champion it to this person. So I think that's a big piece is how you frame, and the intent of your advice is not to substitute for their own, but to help augment and support what they want to do. I think you have a higher chance of being heard and listened to that way.
That's fabulous. Sharon and then Kendall.
So hearing you speak, what I've read is, that's the beauty of being in the room together. So thank you. I have a question that's along the employee resource groups, ERGs. Is everyone here familiar with them? It's a new development within companies, medium to large, for a safe place for employees to go to have discussions. There's one at A&E, I've been talking with them, that is for the 50+ population employees they have, and it's for them to know, it could be educational, where what do I do for retirement and what else can I do in the company? How can I repurpose myself? And my suggestion to them, which is a little over the top, but this is what I want to talk to you about, is we also need to make that intergenerational, because we need to take them out of their silos, the 20-something, 30-something, or middle management, lower management, and then bring them around their table. And the way I also paraphrase it is, one of the reasons that the entrepreneurial formula is working is because age is not part of it. It's those who have the passion and the interest, no matter the age or the generational title, come around the table together to work together. So I'm curious to know, Megan, with all that intro, how's that working for you, and how can you help us with that?
So I think you hit the nail on the head. Where I'm seeing the traction occur are actually intergenerational employee resource groups versus the ones that are for 50+ or millennials. Or I've been working with 2 different organizations that have tried this intergenerational. I feel like it really speaks to people. I think that's how we get away from, it's great to have people my own age that I sit around and talk about the things that are bothering me, but that's not how we're going to solve these issues, right? It's hearing other people's perspectives and realizing they're not that far from my own, or we're having the same challenges, or we are misunderstanding each other. So there's a pretty big company I work with that their intergenerational resource group has over 5,000 people in it. And I don't believe any of their just like age specific resource groups ever had that many. So I think that's a topic worth trying. And basically people are joining because they want to normalize this idea that every generation has something to teach and something to learn. And it's a place where older people can comfortably say, hey, I would love to learn X. And younger people can comfortably say, I'm really struggling with why would somebody be willing to mentor me, and then, you know, those matches can occur. So I think that's the way that we should be doing it, is more intergenerationally.
Got it. Thank you.
Great. Kendall, and then we'll let Meg ask the final question to honor the time. So, and then if everyone would hang on at the end for a minute so we can discuss digging deeper on Monday for a bit, but I want to honor Megan's time. So Kendall, go ahead.
I'm concerned about how the polarization in the culture may impact communication, and just not intergen communication, but on the spot, accusing somebody of using sexist language or not using the proper pronoun or whatever, and how what could be a discussion gets derailed by certain language that gets used, or references about, you know, a comment that was used as perceived as racist or sexist or whatever. And how do you get through that when that sort of comes up?
Yeah, what a great topic. So I'll just talk a little bit about, so I did a session for the Future of Work Institute where it was on how different generations have learned to talk about diversity, or whether they learned to talk about it at all. And one of the issues was pronouns. And, you know, it's very interesting because there's certain things, whether it's race or age or whatever we're talking about, you know, the phrase I like to use is they were of their time. Right? Like, you used to be able to say that, or maybe you shouldn't have ever been able to say that, but you used to be able to. And now if you say it, it's offensive to people. And so like, I use pronouns quite a bit because it is such a hot topic. And like, my son has friends who use a they pronoun, and I really struggle with saying they. I very much respect their identity. And, you know, he tends to snap at me. My niece does with my brother-in-law. And so I actually said to both of them, you know, I apologize. Please keep reminding me. I want to just give you some context that when I was growing up, they actually referred to more than one person. So grammatically, it takes my brain a minute to remember to say they, not because I disrespect this person or I'm not interested in using their pronoun, but because I didn't grow up having that language available to me, right? The same way you grew up with different technology than I did. So, you know, I want you not to misjudge my behavior as disrespectful, but help me learn. And so I think it's a big question you're asking, because you're right. We're in a society where, you know, of course we all need to be learning and appreciating, but we also really quickly jump on judging that someone meant the worst possible thing, when in fact, you know, they spent their lifetime not understanding or not having that be a norm. So that's, I think, to me, it's trying to open up that curious thing about, you know, how can I help you remember that this person's pronoun is they, or, you know, can we talk a little bit about why I think this is important? And obviously we're not going to solve that, probably just not even all of us here as motivated as we are. But you're right. I think, you know, I try to just always go for, let's understand why that was of its time, or let's hear from somebody who had a different experience and how they're learning to try to do better. I think that's the best we can do.
Fantastic answer. Thank you. Meg, we'll give you the honor last. And I'm just, for those who don't know, Meg is the founder of the Life Planning Network. So we honor her.
I'll never live up to that honor, this honor here. But I have to apologize for coming in late, and I hope but it's been fascinating. And I wonder, this is just quick, whether you know about Living Room Conversations, that group, because it's all about how to reach common understanding and trust among people who are polarized. And I would think that you could offer a lot of material to them on this particular one. I have a question, just because, and you may have talked about it. Do you think there's some kind of, probably depends on the people, but some kind of at least bias toward wanting to connect across generations between grandparents and grandchildren? That is something that we could take advantage of.
I do, and I'm not familiar with the living room conversations, but it makes me think of the Chip Conley's Generations Around the Table. I can't remember exactly what he calls it, but something, similar. I think so, because I think if you do have a family unit, and so I often encourage around holidays, the fact of, even questions like, what do you think is one of the biggest misperceptions about your generation? Or I've heard this about your generation. Do you think that's true or not? Because I think some stereotypes are rooted in some really interesting norm differences. I'll someday later tell you why I don't necessarily think the Gen X slacker stereotype is necessarily wrong. I think it's a comparison, right? It's a life balance comparison, but I think that's a great place to start, right? Every day we have cross-generational opportunities to try out some of these questions. Like you could tonight try out, like, can you help me understand? Or how would you do this? Or you're struggling with something at work and you say, like, how would you handle this issue? Just to sort of flex that muscle, right? And then see if they're more willing to listen to you talk about why it matters or why it's important because you asked their opinion first. So I think that's a great idea, Meg. I really do.
Well, I think your advice is applicable to life in general.
Thank
And
you.
to
I appreciate that.
And to improving our culture and society in general, every aspect. Yes, thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Meg, for that. And, I was sitting here thinking, I often have the luxury of reviewing for editing our sessions with authors, but this is one in particular that I feel like I can't wait to go back and look at the video on this and take notes from the video, because in the moment, some things escape me, but this is really a great teaching lesson, I think, for all of us, Meg, and I hugely appreciate your doing this. So, I think this is of enormous value to us as an organization and to our members who work with people and can take the knowledge and wisdom that you provided today, and hopefully we'll get your book. I'll do another pitch, Gentelligence. Can't break it, and buy it and ask others to read it, because it is so valuable, and so many of our folks have clients, and I'm sure not everyone wants to read a book that is somewhat academic, but it's filled with lessons. So I hope everyone will.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I'll also, Bruce, if people are interested, I didn't want to overwhelm people with too many links and resources. I do have a Gentelligence Academy, which is a remote learning platform. It's got over 2 hours of my training videos and a bunch of exercises you can use with your team. I also have a Gentelligence Academy page on LinkedIn where people who are interested in this tend to go. And I try to post questions or topics or things for people who want to weigh in and share their perspectives. I'm happy to send those to you. If you guys want to talk about on Monday, I can send those your way.
Yeah. So if you send them to me, not only can we talk about it Monday, but I can create an article for our community platform so everybody can see it whenever they want. And, we'll post this video as well so people can get both the advantages of both. And maybe people, I suspect there are a lot of people in LPN who might be interested in going to the academy. So thank you. That's great.
Yeah, of course.
Well, this has really been a treat, and just a lot to think about has been said. So I really don't want to overstay, but I greatly appreciate it. Thank you all for participating.